Conversation with a Geographer. I'm Mike DeVivo, professor of geography at Grand Rapids Community College, and today we are fortunate to have Kirsten Greer, associate professor of geography at Nipissing University. Kirsten, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you for inviting me to be part of this series.
Well, it's a pleasure, and we know you're going to make a great contribution. As we start off with all of these, essentially, I'm going to ask you to reflect upon your background, maybe your childhood, and ponder, perhaps, maybe you already have pondered, what really sparked your interest in geography?
I guess if I go back to my childhood, I became interested in places and histories through my dad, who was a doctor, but he was very curious about the world. And he had a collection of books called the Books of Knowledge, and apparently they were edited by a distant relative in the UK. And I would flip through those books, and obviously at that time period, the articles were very much about British Empire and colonization, and I became really interested in the links between, at that early age, the links between Britain and its empire. Mm-hmm. And I was also into collecting frogs and snakes, and so the natural aspect, field work, was very much part of my growing up. And I grew up in Montreal as well, so I'm from Canada. I'm Canadian, and just exposure to the world, a lot of travel as well with the family.
Where did you travel when you were growing up?
We would spend quite a bit of time in the Lake District in England when I was growing up. But then we also went to Greece. My dad is born in Glasgow, so those were some family links there. And my mom's side's Norwegian, Swedish. So I was in Scandinavia to see family there. And then as well, just going down to the Caribbean. We traveled my parents were always not resort people. So we would always stay in villages rather than, as a kid, I always wanted to be at a place with pools and beaches, but we really spent time with families in these villages and ate local food and just explored all the different heritage sites. And so I guess I became a nerd quite early on.
Well, it sounds
a geography nerd.
It sounds like a wonderful apprenticeship for becoming a geographer, I'll say. It's great. Did you know many children who had similar experiences when you're growing up? Because I sure didn't.
Yeah, I don't think I did. And I didn't know that you could pursue geography until in Quebec, we don't go straight into university. If we do high school, like elementary and high school, we have to go to a place called CEGEP, which is pre-university, and it's a 2-year program. But it's set up as a pre-university setting where you determine whether you do social sciences or sciences. And that's when I saw on the books that you could actually study geography. And it was taught by a McGill University grad. And that was my favorite course. I took geography every single semester, and I knew, leading up to university, that's what I wanted to do, which, my other friends, geography wasn't even on their radar.
Sure. So, and then you ended up going to McGill. Talk about your experiences at McGill.
I think at the time I didn't appreciate as much being there and just how the history and tradition of geography in Canada existed in that department. But now that I'm looking at the history of that department, I'm really thankful that I took a BA in geography, even though I don't call myself a physical geographer, but I had to take physical geography courses, geomorphology, environmental science, but as well be integrated. They actually did have historical geography as part of the department. So I was exposed to all subfields of geography, which has allowed me to really zone in on what it means to be interdisciplinary and practice interdisciplinarity. So I was really fortunate to have gone there for 4 years in the 90s. And also the international development was also very much a part of that program, political ecology. So we are already critiquing, resource development in Latin America and Africa. And so I'm really lucky that I did my BA there. it's really shaped my research trajectory that I'm currently pursuing today.
Well, and I suppose that the foundation in physical geography that was part of that program really provided you with the foundation for exploring past landscapes.
Yes, definitely. And now I'm collaborating with physical geographers where we're integrating, a historical geography lens of past landscapes and the impacts of culture and perceptions on these landscapes, but bringing in the physical geography analysis. So whether it's working with a historical climatologist to look at histories of historical geographies of extreme weather events such as hurricanes, or working with a dendrochronologist where we're actually using the historical timbers to think about how can we know the past through tree rings and
Sure.
interpretation, like isotopic analysis to where the trees came from.
Well, it's interesting that you bring up dendrochronology, as that was a field that some early climatologists in the 20th century really practiced. Ellsworth Huntington, for example, in order to assess past climates. And here you're able to do it with a much higher level of accuracy and reliability. That's wonderful.
But you also bring in, Huntington. So working with
Sure.
the physical geographers, the importance of being critical of those histories, right? And
Sure,
environmental
absolutely.
determinism. So that's where we've been developing and helping to shape what people are calling critical physical geography right now, a subfield. And so that's where we're really like, what does it mean to be critical from a historical geographer versus a dendrochronologist? Critical has different meanings, whether it's quality control, the lab work being critical, like, and having their labs certified on all that versus being more critical of the histories of our discipline, as you know.
Oh, absolutely. And I believe it's not only important, but it's a certain paradigm in exploring the history of our discipline that enables us to accentuate addressing these matters beyond the hero worship and to that critical perspective, which is so very important. History, as we know, is complicated. It's very complicated. There's little with regard to black and white in examining history so often. Well, let's talk. So you're at McGill, and McGill was really known for its strong program in physical geography, and yet you explored the Bachelor of Arts side. It was known for that program that F. Kenneth Hare was really, really responsible for engineering in so many ways. Do you think you would have gotten that strong physical background had you gone elsewhere?
I don't think so. Although when we talk about my doctoral work, there was that boundary crossing. But to talk about Kenneth Hare, I know we mentioned him before this interview started, because I've been looking at the historical geographies of McGill University's research stations in the Caribbean, the subarctic, and the Arctic. And Kenneth Hare was instrumental to those research stations and the practicing of interdisciplinarity at an earlier iteration in the 50s and 60s. But he was also integrating Carl Sauer into the shaping of the Department of Geography at McGill and the funding through the Naval Research Office. So those connections between the historical geography of Berkeley shaping the Department of Geography in Montreal. And it was David Watts that was co-supervised by a cultural geographer, Theo Hill, and Kenneth Hare. So I was fascinated, like, how did that work? And then the course offerings that the Department of Geography offered, if you were to do geography, you had to take history courses on European imperialism. And so, when we're thinking about what it means to do critical physical geography today, there were earlier iterations of this. They didn't call it that back then, but we need to acknowledge those traditions as well, that we're not just coming up with something new.
Thank you so much for sharing that, because this is a chapter that is very much needed in examining our discipline, and I hope to see your work on that in the future. Are you planning to write a piece on that?
So we have a piece on the McGill research stations, especially the one in Barbados, in historical geography. And that was part of a special issue on critical physical geography.
Right, I saw that.
And as well, we just published, I published with the dendrochronologist Adam Schenk, who was a Nipissing
He's at
University.
Nevada now, I believe, right?
He's at Nevada. And we just published a research paper in a special issue in Canadian Geographies on how to practice critical physical geography. And that was based on research that we did in Bermuda, looking at the old Royal Navy dockyard, because I've been really interested in the legacies of British imperial military infrastructure. And so that dockyard was built in the 1820s. And what oral history has suggested that the timbers were actually from Atlantic Canada, old growth forest from Atlantic Canada.
Around New Brunswick.
Yeah, exactly. And so Adam thought that might be a good way for him to actually get to those old growth trees through the historic timbers. And so we put together a research team, went to Bermuda. And so that research paper is based on the research that we did, taking timber samples of the Royal Navy dockyard. And so that just came out. But doing this type of work takes a long time, because where do we, publishing an interdisciplinary piece, you can't like the reviewers, either they're physical geographers or human geographers, and each have their own critiques of the work. But it's a longer time to publish.
The eclectic geographers are few and far between nowadays. But you bring up the Atlantic Canada timber, and I think of Graham Wem's book, on forests in New Brunswick as well. Another magnificent Canadian historical geographer for sure.
Graham's.
So you went on for graduate work from McGill. Would you comment on that? And
So I went to it was University of Waterloo Laurier graduate program. It involved the two geography programs at each university, and then also you could be co-supervised by faculty from both universities. This is where I met and I took a course in historical geography with the former feminist historical geographer Jean K. Elke, and she became my supervisor. And
was she dean there at the time?
She might have been chair when I started.
Okay.
But she was a wonderful. Well, she is a wonderful woman. Inspired me. I became hooked on historical geography. I remember we were, doing readings on historical ecological reconstructions, but then looking at land ownership through the lens of gender. And that's when
she has done some marvelous work. I mean, coming from her days at the University of Utah and then going on to Canada, still just a wide range of historical geographical studies that often include the environment.
And then shaping people such as Karen Morin, right? Supervised Karen Morin. And through that network, I remember going to, were you at the Quebec City Historical Geography Conference?
No, I wasn't at the Quebec City one. No.
I just met all these historical geographers, and I just thought, well, these are my people. At a as a master's student. And I remember meeting.
The only one that I went to actually was in Auckland.
Oh, nice.
Yeah.
I've heard about that one with Hayden Lorimer, I think.
So you studied with Jean Kay, and then?
And then I went to Queen's University. I was supposed to go to the UK, and I was going to be working with David Lambert, who is a historical geographer, but is in a history department now at Warwick University. And with Felix Driver at Royal Holloway, I was going to pursue my PhD there. And then because I had a family, I ended up having a daughter. And so it just wasn't feasible for me to bring the whole family to the UK. So then I went to Queen's University in Kingston, Ontario. I worked with Laura Cameron, who's also a historical geographer. And I had supervisors in history and in geography. And so that's how I was shaped by both of those disciplines. But then you had to take a graduate course at the PhD level with your physical geography colleagues. And this is where we talked and studied the histories of our discipline. And it was really interesting to see the tension between the physical geographers and the human geographers and the discussions and debates. But now that I know the physical geographers hated that course, but now, later on in their careers, they realize how important it was to take that course, and they now appreciate the fact that we were all integrated into that one course. So I do think it was interesting to see the physical geography, human geography cultures that they're obviously a source of tension, but yet I think that's one of our strongest suits of our discipline is that the tensions then facilitate more creative ways of collaborating and finding commonalities.
Absolutely. And Queens has such a rich tradition in historical geography.
Right. You have Audrey Kobayashi, you have Anne Godleska, you have George Lovell. Some of these people, right, scholars now might not call themselves a historical geographer, but they've been trained in historical
contributed
geography.
to the field. And there has been some really good work that's come out of Queens. And so talk about your research for your doctorate.
My doctorate focused on a group of British military officers who were the geographers of the British Empire in the 19th century. They were the ones, when they were stationed in the different colonies across the globe, would be mapping, they would be collecting natural history specimens and watercolor landscapes. I was interested in a group of officers that were particularly fascinated with birds, because I just wondered, I know that geology and botany are instrumental science to empire. Why were they collecting birds in all these places? And, if they had a collection of birds, how did that, and they were traveling across different climates and environments, how did that shape their ornithological understanding of, different species of birds and different environments, but as well as their migration patterns? And I focused on a group of officers that seemed to have intersected in the British Mediterranean, which was key to the empire, especially with the Suez Canal opening up. So protecting the route to India. And through these officers and their collections, I realized that they were the ones that were sending information to Wallace and, my goodness, the zoogeographer. They co-published on the 6 zoogeographic regions of the world, Slater. And the officers I was focusing on were determining the divisions between the European and African avifauna, and how that was all tied into ideas of race. And also the fact that when they were stationed in the Mediterranean, they realized that, our British birds are actually migrating back and forth from Britain, Europe to Africa, and then realizing the migration patterns and focusing on the local cultures of nature in those places, because in Malta, it was their belief that they've been hunting migratory birds since time immemorial. And so the British, obviously, once they realized all these birds were being killed, started, creating these conservation laws and what constituted a British bird. So it was all tied into these ideas of history of our discipline and zoogeography to our discipline's connection to British Empire, and also the colonial histories that included histories of racism.
Mm-hmm. And from that research, you were able to generate an article in the Annals of the Association of American Geographers, and then a book published by University of North Carolina Press, which has received favorable reviews. I find it very striking, actually, that it didn't occur to me that the military officers' bird collections, or even a bird collection in the scientific community was a status symbol of sorts. It makes sense as I think about it, but it also gives us, I think, a different impression of the cast of characters that were shaping science at the time in so many ways. What also I find striking is this imperialistic behavior imposed upon the people of Malta or elsewhere with regard to conservation or preservation. We do that very well in so many places, and you've remarked about that with regard to present day bird hunting in some places.
That was when I was in Malta in 2009. It was during the EU elections, and I didn't realize that the bird hunting issue was the number one issue in Malta. And I would wait for the bus to go to the archives or to the museums, and I would speak with local Maltese, and they would just talk about their ambivalence towards the British, because they provided jobs with the dockyard there. But yet it involved, the imposition of colonial rule, and also how these preservationists from the UK would organize these trips every fall and winter, to save the birds, and they would just show up, and I just learned and felt the tension that brought with, and how they didn't think about their colonial connections to Malta, and that's really important to understand if you're going to show up in a new country, like another country, and impose your own ideas of protectionism, like conservation.
Well, I think that the global North has a habit of imposing its values on the global South, and that oftentimes results in disenfranchising indigenous peoples in certain areas. And though Malta may be considered Europe, it's seemingly in the 19th century not necessarily a full-fledged European entity. It's more of a crossroads between Africa and Europe. And so
it's semi-civilized. That was not.
There you go. And so those places that are uncivilized or semi-civilized apparently are perceived as requiring a representative or an administrator from the global North to set them straight.
I think being a Canadian there, I was granted access to, the archives or collections or stories of Maltese that probably wouldn't have been shared if I was a UK academic. It was really interesting.
Or even an American, probably either. But yeah, being Canadian, you certainly had some privileges for sure. Would you care to comment on something that was striking to you during your time in Malta, aside from learning about this issue associated with hunting in the EU? What was your impression of going across the landscape in a particular day?
I'll comment quickly on that, but there was something that was quite striking for me when I was there. First, it was so hot. I wasn't used to that type of, climate. It's dry. But I did want to talk about the migrant issue there, because when I was I was focused on migrant birds, but I was staying in a family's house, and the husband was head of the Maltese army for surveillance of the African migrants crossing the Mediterranean, and that was really emotional because someone gave me a tour of the facilities where they were processed, and then we went by the facility at 5 a.m, I think it was, because maybe if my flight had come in that early, and just to see the amount of people, migrant laborers that were standing outside to be picked up for free labor, and the racism too that I saw and felt when I was there. I mean, it's still a contentious issue today, and so that was really striking for me in terms of even thinking about geography and migration, and who is considered European and who isn't, or given rights. And yeah, so that's, if I were to think about my trip to Malta, that was the most striking memory that I have of being there.
Well, thank you for sharing that. It's interesting that here you go, really, as a geographer, to toil in the archives, and you, as a geographer, are picking up on the nuances associated with the contemporary landscape that might remain concealed otherwise. You know, so you finished your doctorate at Queen's. You've completed this research. Would you care to comment then on where you went after Queen's?
So the reason why I'm at Nipissing University is because I am a Canada Research Chair in Global Environmental Histories and Geographies. And I guess I'll comment on the research trajectory that my doctoral work took to coming to Nipissing University, which is on the traditional territory of Nipissing First Nation and Doki's First Nation, and the lands protected by the Robinson-Huron Treaty of 1850. So what does it mean to work in relationship with the First Nations in this region? And I came here and gave a presentation on, because I've done so much archival and museum research in the UK and the United States focused on the empire, because the Treaty of 1850 was with the British government. I gave a presentation and I knew where some materials of this region were in museums and archives. And I gave this presentation demonstrating the locations of these items and the context of why they were stolen, you know, whether it was a British military officer that toured the Ottawa River all the way to Lake Huron, and he stole in 1840, a Royal Engineers officer stole a birch bark map that was hand drawn by a member of this region, like an indigenous person had drawn it, stole it, and then sent it back to England, which is now currently the map is at the British Library. So I was approached after that presentation by a member of Doki's First Nation who said, we need to collaborate because we want more information on materials before 1850. And we also want to do some repatriation work. And it was through Doki's First Nation. And then I started collaborating with Nipissing First Nation that share this homeland and traditional territory about finding these types of sacred objects and materials for repatriation for the two communities. And I know that, academia, we're supposed to publish books and articles, but a lot of this work is just involving what I am calling museum and archival activism that doesn't necessarily have an output that's scholarly, right? Because you're just responding to the community needs, and a journal article is not as significant to them as a research report just to find out where some of these items are. And so recently I was in Chicago. I was asked to do some research at the Field Museum in 2017 because human remains from this territory were stolen by Franz Boas and his networks of collectors who were creating the anthropological exhibition as part of the Columbian Exposition of 1893. And so I was asked to do research into how those human remains were stolen from the territory. So then uncovering that Franz Boas had been networking with the Indian Department, Indian Affairs here in the Dominion of Canada, and was granted access to all the Indian agents that, oversaw these communities. And so they would have known where some of these burial sites were. And That was really emotional work. I went to the Field Museum and I was supposed to be with a member of Doki's First Nation, Randy Restool. He was supposed to join me to visit with the human remains at the museum, and he wasn't able to join me, but he asked me to go there to, say some words to them, just as well spend time with them. And that was really emotional work because I was brought down to the basement where the collections room is held. And just, because we know the history of our discipline, and Franz Boas is considered the father of anthropology, but at that time period, he was studying with geographers, and there was very much that environmental racism that was going on, and the types of collecting, like what they were interested in, the human remains. And I went into the collections room, and you read, we study it, but then when you actually see it, it's very emotional. So that was 2017, and the Doki's First Nation has been working with the Chicago Field Museum to have those human remains repatriated. So Chief Duquette from Doki's and elders, where they visited the museum as well, and they set up a repatriation that occurred this last summer. So the human remains came home, and just a month ago, I was invited to be part of the reburial ceremony of those human remains, and that was really emotional. So I'm just very thankful for the work that I do and where I live and the people I work with and working in relationship with. And so that's just one of the trajectories that my doctoral work has taken me, because when I was looking at these natural history collections back in the 19th century, even though, you had birds and plants, but the human remains ended up in these natural history collections. And so that's how I knew where to look. So that's the work that's most significant for me right now here at Nipissing University.
As it should be. It's so very striking and so very important. And it's quite obvious that you were able to make a significant difference, perhaps largely because of your expertise in historical geography and your passion to do what's right. So you've remained then at Nipissing University, and you're teaching courses in geography. You're supervising graduate students in environmental studies, I guess, and also students in geography. What is different, do you think, about teaching there as it would be in a university closer to the U.S. border?
So I think being in a smaller university in Northern Ontario, I love working here. I love my colleagues. It allows for more experimentation. At the graduate level for our Masters of Environmental Science and Studies, it's very much about interdisciplinarity. And, not sometimes we have the opportunities to co-teach. So I will co-teach with, I've co-taught with our hydrologist, April James, who was a Canada Research Chair in hydrology at the time. And to co-teach a course on perspectives on the environment to students that come from biology, geography, chemistry, history. So our program also integrates history as part of the graduate program, is the most rewarding thing to me. And our students are so strong. Some of them are very open to being co-supervised by an environmental scientist and a historical geographer. And so I don't know if I would have had those opportunities if I was at a bigger university, or, also being place-based, being on the territory here versus being in an urban environment, or, which would be closer to the States.
Well, it sounds like you have really carved out for yourself a wonderful place to pursue your career, or the remainder of your career. And as you reflect upon your career, I'll ask you, with just about a minute to go here, do you have any words of advice for students interested in pursuing graduate studies in geography, or even colleagues in geography? Do you have any pearls of wisdom you'd like to share?
I guess one thing that I've really like made sure that I've kept is my sense of imagination, because when you put together these research projects with different expertise and you have different questions, you have to have this imagination of how it's all going to work. And being curious and reading across disciplines and not being in a silo. I think that's really important if you do want to do interdisciplinary work. And the sharing, being, generous with, your colleagues and your students. And I don't know if that answers the question, but that's one thing that I've I maintain in these relationships that I have, whether they're on research projects or with the communities.
Mm-hmm. Well, crossing disciplinary boundaries and being willing to go out into the community and listen, those are very important attributes. Well, thank you so much for spending this time with us. It has been a wonderful episode, and I'm sure there'll be many that will want to view this. I wish you the best in the rest of your career, and this concludes this session of Conversation with a Geographer. Thank you.